China has the largest navy in the world. It grows every year by the same size as the French Navy. So we are minuscule by comparison.
Hello. For more than 20 years, we in the West have been focused on various geopolitical challenges: the war on terror, Russia, global financial crises, and the rise of populism. All the while, China has grown in both economic and military strength. Joining me today is Frank Gardner, the BBC Security Correspondent and author of the new thriller Invasion, which places China and Taiwan at its centre as Britain and the US seek to assist the Taiwanese against their more powerful neighbour. We talk about the situation in the South China Sea, the United States and Britain's attitude to China, and vice versa, spying, and the prospects for war in that part of the world. This conversation was made possible by the Chalk History Festival, the UK's #1 history festival, where I'll be introducing Frank and sponsoring his talk on Sunday the 30th of June at 4:30pm. So if you're in the Salisbury area here in the UK, head on down. Links to the website are in the show notes where you'll find that and many other great subjects. But until then, I'll hand you over to me talking with Frank Gardner on China and Taiwan. Frank, welcome to the podcast. It's a great pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure.
It's great to have you on because we're going to be meeting in person in a month or so for the Chalk History Festival. And so this is, I guess, a sort of a precursor to that for aspects of history. And we're really talking about your new book, Invasion, which I've read, I've torn through in no time at all.
Well done.
It's fantastic. And it's the invasion of Taiwan. And so I wanted to just ask you a few questions really about, really about the whole security situation in that part of the world. And I suppose my first question was, from a British standpoint, do you think we resolved what we would be doing, how we would be involved in the event of Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Because indeed, we're quite heavily involved in the novel.
No, I don't think we have. I asked Liz Truss exactly this question when she was Foreign Secretary. I asked her at the Madrid summit 2 years ago, and she didn't give a straight answer. I don't think there is a clear policy. I mean, we are Britain. I say we. The UK is part of AUKUS, the Australia-UK-US partnership, which was designed, it was built around a common policy of building Australia's new fleet of submarines, but also it's a sort of mini NATO, or it has been described as a mini NATO, to try and counter Chinese takeover of various islands and areas in the South China Sea. It's a bit late for that because that's pretty much already done. And it's attracting interest in joining from countries like the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, which are generally pro-Western, but also they fear Chinese expansion. I don't want to give away whether Taiwan does get taken over or not in the book. The backdrop, this is fundamentally, it's a spy thriller book to which the backdrop is an imminent Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and it's a race to try and stop it, to get the data out of an agent who's gone missing in Hong Kong that could stop this invasion.
Yes. And so I guess on the Chinese side, within the Chinese government, I guess it's difficult for us to know, but there will always be competing interests within the Chinese government. But do you think there is clear intent to take Taiwan at some point? It's just a matter of when? Or is that even something we can know?
They've made that pretty clear. Since Xi Jinping came to power, and I think it was 2012, he has absolute power. I mean, yes, there are competing interests, but he is the supreme authority. The way the Chinese Communist Party operates, it's not nearly as collegiate as previous leaders have been, even Jiang Zemin, for example. So he has made it very clear on many occasions, as have some of his subordinates, that Taiwan will return to the motherland. They consider it to be a renegade province. They've said that an absolute red line is Taiwan trying to declare independence. And the newly elected president, William Lai, has, I think, been quite adroit in the sense that he has tried to reassure China that they're not planning to declare independence, but nevertheless they don't want to be taken over by China. I don't know if you've been to Taiwan, but it's a very benign place. It's, they're a very nice, quite sort of docile people, unlike the rather martial attitudes that you get on the mainland in the PRC, the People's Republic. Taiwan knows that it is vastly outnumbered by every metric by their huge neighbour, which can muster 2 million men under arms. But its best defence is the Taiwan Strait, which is only, if you were going to put an invasion force across that, there's only 2 times the year you could do it when the winds would allow it. There are only 14 beaches on Taiwan where you could successfully land a force. And they know that force would come under heavy missile attack. Taiwan would pretty soon run out of missiles, but I think it's counting on the United States coming to its aid.
Yes, we've had, speaking of the United States, I had a conversation with General Petraeus on this very matter, and he was talking about the real difficulty of any kind of amphibious attack on the island of Taiwan. Do you think that's something then that's really the main reason why we haven't seen any kind of significant military attack on Taiwan, just because it's such a difficult prospect?
I think they've got other priorities at the moment. They've got to sort out the economy, housing, unemployment, usual sort of domestic things like that. But they're also watching to see how the Ukraine war goes. Big, well-armed country invades much smaller neighbor. Obviously it's going better for Russia now, but there was a time when it was disastrous for Russia. It still is disastrous for Russia because they've lost so many men, but their commanders don't seem to care about that. What China is doing to Taiwan is to intimidate it. So every time there has been a spike in tension, when Nancy Pelosi, for example, the US speaker, controversially visited the island a couple of summers ago, they essentially surrounded it and tried to cut off the island with a lot of maritime firing ranges, a huge amount of aircraft activity, drones, and manned crewed aircraft as well. And I think what the PRC would rather do, well, ideally, they would like to see Taiwan fold from the inside. They would much rather that pro-Beijing voices inside the KMT, for example, the Kuomintang party, as opposed to the ruling party, they'd much rather see it volunteer to join Beijing, to be ruled from Beijing. But they made a historic mistake, I think, the Chinese, in that the People's Republic, in that the way they handled democracy activists in Hong Kong has been closely watched in Taiwan. Taiwan is a democracy, and it's quite progressive. It's the first country in Asia to legalize gay marriage. It's a very liberal place. It used to be, not under Chiang Kai-shek, but it is now. And Taiwanese don't want to be under the boot of the People's Republic. So if it's not going to vote to do that, then I think what the PRC will most likely do is eventually try to suffocate it, try to squeeze it like a kind of anaconda, so that eventually, in desperation, with its airports closed to the outside world, its maritime trade interdicted, its internet cut off, Taiwan begs for to make a deal and tries to salvage what it can. That's the way I see it going. If the People's Republic decide they are going to make a move on it.
Well, the other key motivation in the book and in reality is the Taiwanese industry of microchips.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this with regard to, we have a US election coming up. And it's, I mean, a long way to go, but it's possible, maybe even probable, that Trump gets elected again. Do you think those microchips could be a motivating factor for Trump to actually come to Taiwan's defense? Because that gives a sort of financial element to the invasion.
Yes, I do. It's a very good point. I'm glad you raised it. So Taiwan is home to something called the Taiwan Conductor Manufacturing Company. They produce over 90% of the world's top-end microchips. I mean, right down to 3 nanometers or nanometers. I mean, microscopically produced. Other countries are catching up, not just China, but the Netherlands, the US, but they're not there yet. And whoever controls that facility will have their hands around the throat of the global economy. These things go into everything that we know: phones, cars, satellites. They are integral to the world economy. I mean, you can shut Russia out from the Western economy without too much damage, as we've seen. You can't shut China out, and you certainly couldn't shut Taiwan out. So if China were to take over that facility, yes, I think that would make people in Congress sit up and take notice. And a former president and now presidential hopeful, Donald Trump, has always made it clear he's more interested in China and US-Chinese competition than he is in Ukraine. He's not interested in Ukraine. He considers that's Europe's problem.
Yes. One thing I noted, you dedicated the book to Admiral John Gower, who sadly passed away recently. And I was reading his obituary, and he seemed, a hugely talented sailor. And I wondered, what was his assessment of Britain's navy, I guess, vis-a-vis a potential involvement, with the AUKUS arrangement and involvement in a Taiwanese invasion. Is he satisfied that the Royal Navy is where it is? Because there's a number of moments in the novel that actually are quite funny, darkly funny, when, both aircraft carriers are getting constantly fixed, can't be used.
Yeah.
So, I wondered what Gower's view was of the Royal Navy today.
Well, he was a submariner, although he commanded surface ships as well and did a lot of time on land in the MOD. His primary interest was nuclear deterrence. So he was an extremely accomplished submariner. I don't think any naval officer, either serving or retired, would say, we've got enough ships. We haven't. I mean, the Navy has shrunk to a tiny size, and there is an argument for saying we are now too small to try to project ourselves on the other side of the planet. So many Royal Navy ships have to what's called double hat, where they're taking on two tasks at the same time. They're doing counter-piracy, for example, or counter-narcotics at the same time. They're supposed to be keeping an eye on the Houthis. They are stretched, and it's expensive. Funny enough, I found myself sitting the other day at some event in Westminster next to Admiral Lord West and General David Richards, and I reminded them I reminded David Richards that he once said to me, "Why do we need 2 aircraft carriers? If we'd had just one, I could have fielded X number of more troops in Afghanistan." I said, "You seem to have patched things up since then." But I mean, we are dangerously small now in Britain. The peace dividend, frankly, is well past its sell-by date. The warning signs were in 2008 when Vladimir Putin made his speech, basically turning against the West. There was a time when there was even talk of Russia joining NATO at the turn of the century. Those days are long behind us, and Russia has been massively rebuilding and upgrading its nuclear fleet, both on land, strategic air, and missile silos, and of course submarines. China has the largest navy in the world. It grows every year by the same size as the French Navy. So we are minuscule by comparison. I mean, the quality of our ships and the men and women who crew them is obviously very high. And I would hesitate to say, but is possibly higher than that of the People's Republic of China on average. But they've got an awful lot of kit. And if you look at the one big message, the one big lesson from the Ukraine war, it's that mass matters. So you can have not terribly good kit and not terribly good commanders, but if you've got enough of them, you can still overwhelm your enemy. And China has invested heavily in hypersonic missiles. It's got this Dongfeng series, the DF-17s and DF-26s, which will shoot up into the atmosphere or even the stratosphere and then come down at up to speeds of up to Mach 8 or even higher. If they can get the guidance system, and it's not easy to try and come down at that speed against a moving target, but it would mean it would be pretty dangerous for the US 7th Fleet to loiter around in a time of conflict within range of those. They'd have to keep moving.
These are these carrier killer missiles, then. Yeah. Awful things reading about those. So just turning to the intelligence war then, because it feels like we are, obviously we don't know about operations going on in China, but it feels as though we're a long way behind the competition for intelligence with China. I suppose because for the last 20 or so years, more than 20 years, we've been focusing on Islamic terrorism.
Islamist, not Islamic, but yes.
Quite right. Thank you. Yes. So do you think then that is the case? We're behind China and it's going to take a lot to catch up?
Well, China has always been a very hard target for Western intelligence to spy on. And remember that these days, so much of espionage is done digitally, is done through cyber. All sides do it. I highly recommend a series of podcasts, essentially, that my BBC colleague Gordon Pereira has done called Shadow War, on basically the competition between the West and China, but particularly on over espionage. It's on BBC Sounds. It's really good. So the Americans, some years ago, they decided that they would connect their spies in China through the dark web, and that they would all sort of log in to a kind of through a coded system. Once the People's Republic of China once the Ministry of State Security had cracked that code for the login, they were able to wrap up the whole network and arrest CIA's entire network of spies in China and send them off to the Gulag, or whatever the Chinese equivalent is. I forget its name. And Britain didn't do that. So they continued to run sort of, my understanding is, and by the way, nobody in MI6 will tell you this. It's what I've gleaned. And they've still got human intelligence sources there. Now, I don't know how well placed they are. I don't know what value of so-called product they're able to get out of there, the raw CX intelligence that MI6 tries to gather there. But their previous chief, Alex Younger, soon after he left post, I guess about 3 or 4 years ago, he appeared at a book festival where I interviewed him on stage. He was a bit nervous about this. He was coming out of the shadows, as it were. And I do remember him saying pretty much what you've just said, that for the last 20 years, we took our eye off the ball when it came to China. We were so busy dealing with counterterrorism, with the invasion of Iraq and the aftermath of that, and Afghanistan. We took our eye off the ball, and China got big. They took over the South China Sea. They have threatened Taiwan. They've persecuted the Uyghurs. They have crushed democracy in Hong Kong. They did all of these things, but most of all, they have essentially turned the South China Sea into a Chinese lake.
I guess the other area that we are struggling with at the moment, and you'll have, I'm sure, read about the recent arrest of 3 Britons on spying charges. I think at least one of whom is Chinese and British nationality. And so I wondered whether that is something that we need to look at here in this country, where we have, I think, large numbers, also in the US, large numbers of Chinese students studying at university here, remaining here, and then joining institutions. And that is potentially a risk as well. Is that fair to say?
So leaving that specific case aside, because obviously it's an ongoing legal case, but you're absolutely right. I think belatedly, the government and the spooks have woken up to this threat of spying within, foreign countries spying within the UK and using their own nationals. And often the pressure is put on those nationals, but often they are, in some cases, paid up members in some countries of the Ministry of State Security. I mean, look, all countries do spying. Britain does it, America does it. China doesn't have a monopoly on that. Where they differ is that they hoover up an immense amount of data digitally, so through cyber, over the internet, and they are able to take advantage often of loopholes and gather an enormous amount of data, which is then stored either in Shanghai or Hainan or wherever. Some of it is encrypted, but eventually they will decrypt it. In terms of people who are here in the UK, the law has recently tightened up on that. So it's now a criminal offence to be operating for a foreign country's intelligence agency. You'd think this would have been done some time ago, but it's relatively recent that this has come in. So they are trying to make Britain a harder target to spy on. But the vast majority of MI5's work is still countering ISIS and Al-Qaeda inspired terrorism, terror plots. The stuff that actually goes bang and kills people, that's still their main effort. But there are increasingly large amounts of people who are having to devote their time to stop Russian and Chinese spying. I mean, the Russians had a massive setback after the it would have been farcical if no one had died, but the Novichok poisoning in March 2018 in Salisbury against the Skripals, that resulted in the very swift expulsion of all Russia's spies in this country, plus a load of people who Russia didn't even know that Britain knew that they were agents. So they put them all on buses to Heathrow and they cleared them out. And Russia's been trying to rebuild that network. The Chinese have been a lot more subtle than that. But I'm quite certain they've got their own network because, as you rightly say, they've got a huge amount of a big pool of people to draw on here.
Well, if we had a Chinese person on this chat, they'd probably be saying, you're still behaving like some kind of imperial power, sending your ships right near our waters, and you're, as you've just said, Frank, you're spying on us as well as we're spying on you. Is this a hangover from our kind of imperial past? I mean, I wonder how much awareness of history that the Chinese have. Operation Boxer comes up in your book. Mm-hmm. I noted, and the Opium Wars are felt there. Is that something that they're very aware of when thinking of a country like Britain?
Yes, absolutely. The Chinese have a far greater sense of history. When I say China, the People's Republic of China have a far greater sense of history, a greater knowledge of history, and still a simmering resentment. I mean, Britain did not behave well in the 19th century. I mean, it was a marauding nation, essentially. And China hasn't forgotten that. Now, we've behaved rather better in more recent years. But China still says Britain has no place sending a navy to that part of the world. The way the UK sees it is that the Royal Navy has a duty to keep the high seas free, so to keep global trade flowing. I mean, $3 trillion a year, an estimated $3 trillion a year of trade pass through the South China Sea every year. North, south, north. It's vital for Australia, which is why Australia is a part of AUKUS. They've got a vested interest in keeping that waterway clear. They don't want a situation, which China wants, whereby every single vessel passing through the South China Sea has to get permission from Beijing before it can sail through what is essentially international waters. This would be like declaring the entire waterway between Greenland and Scotland, it suddenly belongs to Denmark, and you have to get Danish permission to sail through the North Atlantic. I mean, it's quite wrong what China has done there, and there's been an international tribunal that ruled against it, but they've ignored that, and possession is 9/10 of the law. They've concreted over quite a lot of these reefs and said this is now our territory, and they've built air defenses and missiles and radar bases and air bases on them. So speaking to a very senior British military officer short while ago, he said, look, there's nothing we can do about the South China Sea. We've left it too late. It's a fait accompli. They have taken over these reefs and islands, and they are the Philippines, which tried to appease China, has now given up on that and is essentially looking for partners, including the US, to try and resist. Chinese Coast Guard and fishing vessels are trying to chase Filipino fishermen out of their national waters that are, well, not their national waters, but waters that are very close to their territorial borders, and say, no, this is Chinese territory now.
Right. Yeah. That's, I suppose, a foreboding message on which to end our conversation, Frank. This has been fantastic. And the book, too, race through it. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I look forward to being introduced by you at the festival.
Thanks, Frank.
Cheers, Oliver.
Thanks for listening. Links to the Chalk History Festival are in the show notes, featuring plenty of great names and subjects in the world of history. But until then, thank you and good night.